Okay, so officially welcome to this special event from Sainer. My name is Lindy Greer. I am a professor at Ross and faculty director of the Sainer Leadership Center. We're thrilled to have you all here today for a special event with a very talented professor at Ross, Mike Barger. Mike's going to provide us with insights on how to plan, prepare, navigate, and overcome crises in today's online session. Professor Barger is a professor of business administration as well as executive director of the Office of Strategy and Academic Innovation at Ross. He teaches some really popular courses at Ross on leadership in crises like this. And additionally, day to day in his director role, also manages a lot of crises for our school in a very positive way. We've been very grateful for his leadership. Mike brings a lot of really interesting leadership experiences to these roles and to his teaching. I mean, I think it's amazing that he was chief instructor for the Navy Fighter Weapons School, which we all know is Top Gun. He was also a founding member of JetBlue, where he also built out their award-winning corporate training function. So he has a host of knowledge about leadership in all sorts of times, especially crises, and we're thrilled to have him today. Let's give him a very warm welcome. Thank you, Mike, for being here.
Hey, great, Lindy. Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. And I'm a little bit sad to be presenting today, not while we're in the middle of our crisis challenge. So clearly some mixed feelings today as I present, but it's great to have you all here. And I look forward to sharing a few thoughts anyway on how we might all be thinking about navigating these particularly challenging times. So as you heard from Professor Greer, I have kind of an interesting professional background, spending 13 years as a flight instructor in the United States Navy flying these airplanes that you see on the screen now. Certainly taught me a lot about leading teams in pretty dynamic, high pressure environments. I was able to translate a good bit of that learning and experience over to my time founding and then running both the corporate university for JetBlue Airways and operations and maintenance. So I got to see the intersection of learning and doing in, again, another particularly challenging environment. And then left my time at JetBlue. I spent 13 years in the Navy, 13 years at JetBlue. Spent about 7 founding and running an education technology company, which taught me a lot about how to take really interesting academic content from business schools into the corporate environment. So as you heard in my intro, have seen quite a bit of challenging scenarios and crises through my professional career. And what I try to bring into the classroom when I teach classes around crisis leadership is really a sense of how crisis leadership is not just about kind of navigating ourselves through that crisis, but when you take on leadership responsibilities, you have to have a sense of what your teams are looking for from you. And that's what I hope to get across today in the next 25 minutes or so. I always like to start these conversations with an acknowledgement of the realities of today's business environment. This term that you see up on the screen now, VUCA, is actually an acronym that was created by Army leadership about 15 years ago. And they used this acronym, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, to describe the battlefield of today, the battlefield environment, as technology improves, as complexity of just interactions and just kind of battlefield dynamics increases. This was a term that just made it easier for military leaders to communicate to warfighters, here's what you're going to be dealing with. And given my experience both in the military and the business world, I see a lot more commonality now between just the incredible messiness of the business environment, the way I like to describe it, and the crazy messiness of the military environment. So just an acknowledgement that the environment that we're all being asked to operate and lead within today is just going to become more volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous. And so the need for leaders who are able to deal with, to help navigate these kinds of environments is just going to be that much more important as we go forward. So something that's definitely worth you investing your time and energy into. In this VUCA world of ours, we see on a regular basis things going sideways in a very major way. Sometimes in an instant, as represented by what you see on the screen here, sometimes over longer periods of time. Ultimately, however, whether they go sideways immediately or over a period of time, it makes it really, these situations make it really clear how important leadership can be. And as a high stakes leader, we need people who are willing to both step up and who are able to lead when the stakes are the highest, when leadership is needed most, and perhaps most importantly and uniquely about a crisis environment, when there's probably not a playbook that you can execute out of. You're going to have to make some things up along the way. And so again, giving this some thought before you find yourself in that situation is really important. As I talk here today, I'd like you to think about what I have to say in the context of this COVID situation that we're working ourselves in. And certainly all of you in the session today have had to think a little bit about, or maybe a lot over these last few weeks, about what this means to you. How does this impact you, your life, your situation, your health, your safety? But I would argue that that's not the only lens that you've been looking at this through. I'm sure you've thought about this as how this crisis impacts your parents, or your grandparents, or your brothers and sisters, your nieces, nephews, cousins. Maybe some of you on the call today even have children, and how this impacts them, your classmates, colleagues, professional acquaintances. Maybe you do run a company today and you have direct reports or people that you work with. All of those different perspectives are going to be viewing this COVID situation differently. And that is maybe my most important theme today in this chat, is how important it is as a high stakes, as a leader, as a crisis leader, to lift yourself out of a situation as it appears to you, and think about how that situation appears through the lens, from the perspective of other people around you. As a crisis leader, a high stakes leader, your effectiveness is going to be driven by the extent to which you can see these challenges from other perspectives. And that's the case I'm going to build over the next 22 minutes or so. So setting the stage here, what you see on the screen, I'll pause for a second. Does anyone recognize this? They don't really have a great way to interact with you through this, so I'm going to pretend that we're interacting with each other, but that's just a bit of a constraint of this virtual environment that we've been forced into here. You ought to recognize this. This was a Mark Wahlberg movie not too long ago called Deepwater Horizon. So this is the Deepwater Horizon oil platform. And even though we haven't defined the term for you yet, just looking at this picture, would you think that this is probably a crisis for somebody? And your answer is probably yes. And my next question then would be, a crisis for whom? Who is this a crisis for? Does anyone remember the name of the company responsible for kind of this Deepwater Horizon project? And if you watched the movie or remember the movie or even remember the news, this is only about 10 years ago, so it's not that long ago. BP was the company that was running this platform. But in reality, and so this was a crisis for BP. But in reality, BP only had a couple of folks even on the platform in the first place. There was another company called Transocean that actually had personnel and employees that were working on this platform. And as this platform explosion killed 11 people and injured another 17, was this a crisis for Transocean as well, if it was their people dying and being injured? Of course it was. Interestingly, and one more interestingly that goes along with this, this photo that you're looking at here, neither BP nor Transocean actually built this platform. Any idea who built this platform? Bonus points if you know who did that. This was actually manufactured by the heavy engineering arm of Hyundai Industries. So as you think about this kind of piece of equipment, a $1 billion plus piece of equipment, if you are responsible for the manufacture of this platform and you've sold dozens of them to different companies, and one of your pieces of equipment is being shown on TV looking like this, you better believe this is a crisis for you as well. I share all of that just to underscore this notion that sometimes it's hard to be able to identify what different stakeholders are really impacted by a crisis that you're living through. Stepping back to my COVID-19 comments a minute ago, it's easy to think about something like this COVID crisis through your own eyes, a lot harder for you to put yourself in the shoes of other perspectives. And the bottom line here ultimately is that perspective really does matter. When we think about this oil platform, we're not only going to think about the perspectives of BP and Transocean and Hyundai, who at a kind of corporate level were concerned about this thing. Certainly the executive teams of all three of those companies were concerned. How about the employees of these three companies? How about the families of the employees? How about customers or community members or investors or channel partners or regulators and advocates or the media? All of these groups, in addition to the three companies responsible for people or product that comes from this platform, all of them had a value proposition in the product that BP created from this platform. And all of these stakeholders had different concerns and required different types, levels, means of communication and support. That, again, number one theme from today's conversation. Now, interestingly, looking back at 50 or so years of management education, for the first 40 of the last 50 years, the general thinking about crisis leadership was that if you were a good manager, you just didn't let crisis happen. If you were doing your job, you didn't have to deal with those kinds of crises. Professor Jerry Myers, who taught a crisis leadership course at University of Michigan for the 35 years before I got to take over his course a few years ago, said consistently that that is not the right way to think about crisis leadership. Don't think about it as something that we should avoid at all costs. Of course, we should do our best to prevent them, but they are going to happen, so we have to figure out ways to deal with them. And I would just point you toward the cover of just about any business trade magazine these days. And those trade magazines don't say, here's what you need to do to prevent crises. They essentially all say today something like what you see on the screen now, which is you're going to have them. Here's what you can learn from them. Here's how they can help you create a better business. Just deal with it. Pick yourself up and learn from it and move on. If you are looking for a little extra reading, because it is certainly time now to find ways to educate yourself while we're at stay at home and trying to figure out how to make the best use of our time. This book, I just put the cover of it up on the screen here, The Excellence Dividend by Tom Peters. Tom is one of my favorite authors, leadership gurus of all time. One of the founders of the McKinsey 7S framework back in the day when McKinsey created that framework that's still in use today. And Tom talks a lot in this book. By the way, go pick yourself up a copy. I don't get royalties for that. It's just, this is a great read. Tom talks a lot about the business environment of today. And he goes so far as to share these two acronyms in the 9th chapter of this book. And these two acronyms are: 1, whoever tries the most stuff wins, and 2, whoever screws the most stuff up wins. What's his point here? His point isn't try to go screw stuff up. His point is, to compete today, we need to get goods and services into the market. We need to get software out to our customers, not when it's 100% ready to go. We certainly don't want to put products out before they're safe. We want to make sure we take care of our customers, but it's no longer is the best way of doing business to get things perfect before we launch them into the market. We just can't wait that long. So we need to get mostly ready products into the market, let our customers tell us which features and functions they like or don't like. We make some adjustments from there and we move on. My point here is that business today is going to force our teams to have to deal with mini crises all the time. Maybe not the burning oil platform that we saw on the initial slides, but little crises that feel like really big ones to your team or members of your unit or your enterprise. So we have to be ready to deal with those. Another thing we need to be ready to deal with, and interestingly, I've used the Ebola crisis to tee up this example for the last few years. Maybe now I have a COVID crisis to be able to replace my Ebola reference with. But another thing we need to be able to deal with in our crisis leadership responsibilities is the impact of social media. And I'm sorry for those of you that have dialed in today on a small screen. This is probably hard to read, and there's a lot of text here, which is a very bad teaching approach. But let me read to you the bold text here. Apologies for those of you that are now halfway through this, and I'm going to make it hard to focus because I'm going to read. But what this says here is, when the next major pandemic strikes, Jay Walker, by the way, back in 2016, wrote this thinking about or working his way through what we saw in the Ebola crisis. He wrote back in 2016, when the next major pandemic strikes, it will be accompanied by something never before seen in human history, an explosion of billions of texts and tweets and emails and blogs and photos and videos rocketing across the planet's computers and mobile devices, down to the lower bold-faced text here. As a result, hundreds of millions of people receive unvetted and incorrect assertions, uncensored images, unqualified guidance, all of which, if acted on, could endanger their own health, seriously damage their economies, and undermine the stability of their societies. First question, and you can't really tell me, but first question is this true? Are we seeing this today? This is what Jay Walker told us we would see when he wrote this 4 years ago. And sure enough, that's what we're seeing. And I'll show you an example in a minute. The bigger question, though, around this kind of phenomenon of social media is, what does this tell us about our communication responsibilities? If we're going to be a high stakes crisis leader, how do we need to be thinking about communications? Okay. And the answer is, we are going to have to own the communication streams. We're not going to be able to give everybody the information all of the time. The reality of a crisis environment is we're not going to have all the information. But if we don't step up very early in a crisis and make it clear that we are going to be the sources of credible information, then the people that are impacted by the crisis are going to do whatever it takes to go find whatever information they can from whatever source that they can. And what we see in crises like the COVID crisis that we're going through now is craziness like this. What do you see on the screen here? Okay, does anyone out there really believe that the novel coronavirus was caused by Corona beer? Okay, was this a crisis for Corona? Well, interestingly, if you go do a search today, and in fact, I just saw this article yesterday and kind of scowled and chuckled all at the same time, people are posting pictures of the beer shelves in their local liquor stores. And what jumps out at you from these pictures? These weren't staged. This is what people are seeing in their stores today. People are avoiding Corona. They bought every other beer in the place. They're avoiding Corona, maybe not because they believe that Corona beer caused the coronavirus, but their behavior certainly suggests that. Again, social media has an incredible impact on how people behave. And so as a crisis leader, as a high stakes leader, you need to own the communication channel. Even if you have not much new information to share, you need to be the source of information. You need to make it clear to your stakeholders that you are going to communicate with them and that they should come look to you for the latest and best information. The bottom line here, crisis happens, okay? No longer is it an if, It's a when. It is going to happen to you. You will find yourself leading a team, a unit, a whole department, or an entire enterprise while it is dealing with a crisis situation. I put up on the slide here now a definition of crisis. We're not going to spend time on this definition. I would emphasize the couple of elements of the definition that are bold-faced here. And I would ask you the question, and if we had more time and we're in an environment where we could interact, I'd ask you the question, what does this definition tell us about what our stakeholders are expecting or fearful of as they are navigating a crisis? Okay? How should this inform our crisis leadership efforts? And here are three things that we are going to now drill into for the next few minutes of my chat. Item one here, in a crisis, and this is what we know from the research, and I think as you look through the lens of our kind of COVID response and how it's impacting your world, you would agree with these things, these statements. Statement one, in a crisis, people will look to leaders for tangible evidence of leadership. You want to see someone up front that is kind of taking charge of what's going on. Secondly, when you look, you want and need leaders that you can believe in. You want to trust that these people have their hands on the wheel and they're navigating the team through this crisis. And third, and this is my advice to you, your best chance to gain the trust of your stakeholders and rally them around kind of how the team is navigating this situation is to fully appreciate, to fully consider, understand, and appreciate their perspective, the perspective of all of the stakeholders impacted by the particular crisis that you're working through. And I'm just going to show you here a handful of examples and ask you a question with each of these images from what you remember of these events. And I think most of these events you will be familiar with. How well do you think crisis leaders engaged their key stakeholders? And again, we don't have enough time to dive into this, nor a mechanism to really interact. But hopefully these images will drive my point home. Okay. You probably all remember this situation when Dr. David Dow was dragged off a United Airlines airplane by security. It was made lots of national and international media, clearly a public perception crisis. Think for a moment as you look at this collection of different stakeholders. Question one would be, is there a particular group of stakeholders or two or maybe even three that if you were the executive team at United, you would engage with as soon as possible to try to kind of put out all of the energy, all the negative energy around this particular scenario? That's kind of question one. And question two, from what you recollect of this scenario, how well did they do? Okay? And what's really important about how you feel that they did, whether it's accurate or not, is the perception of stakeholders, true, correct or incorrect, okay, factual or otherwise. The perception of stakeholders is really important when it comes down to building and maintaining trust as a leadership team. So kind of what you felt, how you remember it really does matter. So here's an example of public perception crisis. Okay. What's going on here? How many of you remember not long ago when a phone company produced a product that was actually exploding in the pockets and purses and and tables, desks of their customers? Well, this was a Samsung problem back with their Galaxy Note 7. The batteries were overheating to the point where they were actually exploding. This is a product failure crisis. Same two questions. Which stakeholder groups probably did Samsung need to reach out to right away to try to deal with this crisis as it was happening? And secondly, how do you recall the effectiveness that Samsung demonstrated in dealing with this crisis? The reality is they actually did a pretty good job here. What's more important, though, is what you remember. Okay? Not long ago at a Starbucks where was this? Anyone remember? Okay, this was down in Philadelphia, if you remember an issue with Starbucks not too long ago. Two black gentlemen sat down in a Starbucks, hadn't ordered anything, sat there for a while. the manager or one of the employees approached the two gentlemen. Can I help you? Are you going to buy anything? Their response was, we're just waiting on a friend. The employee walked away. 15 or so minutes later, the employee came back, still waiting on your friend. Are you going to buy anything? They had a bit of a heated conversation. And 15 minutes later, the two gentlemen were being walked out of the building in handcuffs by the police. Okay. Question one, given all of the news, is there a particular stakeholder group or collection of stakeholder groups that you would say we need to engage these people right away? The folks standing here at this podium are civil rights groups that really grabbed onto this thing as a civil rights issue. And then secondly, what's your recollection about how well Amazon managed this? I'm sorry, Amazon, Starbucks managed the green and white, managed this this situation. And they actually, in many ways, did a pretty good job. They actually shut down all of their stores for 2/3 of a day to complete some company-wide training, which is pretty amazing. Okay, and what's going on here as Steve Jobs and Tim Apple, if you will, Tim Cook were doing a road show talking about the fact that Steve was stepping down for health issues. Tim Cook was going to take over as the new CEO. Was this a crisis for Apple? And interestingly, it was, even though it was just a leadership change. Okay, and as you look at these different stakeholders and think about how each of them were perceiving Steve leaving and Tim taking over, you can see why certain stakeholder groups here were really concerned about this transition. And so it really was a crisis, totally different than the other ones, but a crisis for Apple. What's going on here? Here is a data security crisis at Facebook. Again, as you think about the stakeholder groups, who should have been really concerned and engaged in this particular situation? Maybe customers, maybe regulators, okay? And secondly, how well did they handle this? Investors were concerned. Facebook lost a ton of value while they were working through that data security crisis. And then finally, we're not going to spend a lot of time here. This is still ongoing. This has been a horrible crisis for the Boeing company. And I challenge any of you to identify any of these stakeholder groups that weren't significantly impacted by this particular crisis. Okay. The bottom line here again is perspectives matter. Each of these stakeholder groups has unique concerns in any of those crisis examples that I just shared with you, and different types of crisis. Okay, all the crises that I just showed you had a different kind of flavor, a different type. Each of those types is going to inform who are the key stakeholders and what specifically are their needs. So with all of that, you might be thinking, well, that's all great, Mike, but I'm not going to be in a position to have to lead a unit or an organization through a crisis. What really are the odds that I will ever have to do this kind of thing? And my response to you would be, I think your odds are 1 in 1. I think they're 100%. As I thought back on my 13 years of time as an executive at JetBlue, and I compared my time there to the 9 different types of crisis that Jerry Myers, whose little quote you've seen at the lower right-hand corner of my slide this whole time, the gentleman who created this course that I teach now back some 40 years ago, when I compared my experience at JetBlue with those 9 different type crises as I was setting up to teach this course, I could find at least 4 examples in every one of Jerry's 9 categories that were crisis level in my time at JetBlue. So I'm going to share some of those with you, but before I do, I want you to think about what you are doing with your family, with your colleagues, with your sons, daughters, nephews, grandparents, parents, to help them navigate the COVID crisis. And I would argue you're actually probably doing some sort of crisis leadership today as we're navigating this crisis. So maybe that underscores the reality that your chances of having to lead in some way through a crisis have already been 1 in 1. You are doing it now. quick run through a collection of the kinds of things that I had to endure at JetBlue, and you might have to in your career someday. Back in 2007, JetBlue had a crisis situation where we dealt with a winter storm in a really bad way, stranded a bunch of people on airplanes for more than 7 hours. It created just a horrific public perception crisis and took us a long time to get through. This is a public perception crisis example. In 2005, we had an airplane take off from Long Beach, California on the way to New York City. And after it took off, a bracket on the nose gear, the thing that's flaming here in the picture, broke. The nose wheel turned 90 degrees sideways and couldn't retract into the belly of the airplane. For 3 hours, this airplane circled Los Angeles Airport, LAX, because this airplane can't reduce weight by dumping fuel. Some of the larger, older airplanes could just, you could turn on a valve and empty the fuel tanks, or nearly empty the fuel tanks, so the airplane could be nice and light when it landed. You might be interested to know that these modern airplanes generally can't land or can't land safely when they're full of gas. You want to be lighter than full. So this airplane spun around LAX airport at a couple of thousand feet for 3 hours while it burned down gas. And if you've ever flown JetBlue, you know that JetBlue was the first airline ever with live television at each seat. So all of the customers on this airplane, what do you think they were watching on TV for the 3 hours this airplane circled around? They were watching the news about themselves, as every news helicopter west of the Mississippi made its way to the LA area to watch this airplane land. Quick side story here. Well, two side stories. One is the Fox News airline industry expert for 3 hours on the news said everyone on this airplane is going to die. That was the message for 3 hours. So thanks, Fox News, for that. The second aside is that JetBlue leadership, while this airplane was circling around LA, decided that we would reposition another airplane from Long Beach to LAX, just right next door, and we would park it next to the kind of the end of the runway here. And our thought was, if a single customer wants to get off this airplane and get on another airplane and fly to New York, which is where they were going, we would take them, even one customer. And what we found is the crew did such a great job navigating this crisis. This airplane landed. The flames you see here were only appearing when the airplane was moving. As soon as it stopped, the flames went out. All the passengers all cheered when the plane stopped. Nobody went down an emergency slide. We pulled up some stairs next to the airplane. Everyone walked down the stairs. Everyone walked down the stairs, high-fived to the fire crews and the ambulances that were there, walked right up the air stairs to the other airplane, and all 150 customers flew to New York. Pretty spectacular outcome for what could have been a pretty ugly crisis situation. This is a product failure crisis. Okay, the rest of these will be much faster. During the time that my last 10 years or so at JetBlue, there was all kinds of merger and acquisition activity during the first decade of the 21st century. There were also a ton of bankruptcies ongoing. So what was happening on almost an annual basis, my last 10 years at JetBlue, is the market shifted almost every year. We had to navigate that. We had to navigate the energy crisis back in the middle of the first decade of this century, where, just to put things into perspective for you numbers-focused people, in January 2005, JetBlue was paying $1.25 a gallon for jet fuel. At that time, okay, that was costing us about 30% of our total cost we spent on fuel, and we were turning a very healthy 7% margin at $1.25 a gallon for gas. By the way, the blue line here is pay at the pump. The red line is buying some fuel futures, but you can see these lines track pretty closely together. By January 2008, there was a period of time in January, we were paying over $4 a gallon for gas. We burned 100+ million gallons in the first quarter of that year and 500 million for the year. If at $1.25, it was 30% of our costs, what do you think it was at $4 a gallon? Okay. That has a real significant impact on your cash holdings. And so we had a cash shortage at that time. After that first winter storm crisis that stranded all the people on the runway or on the airport for 7+ hours, we ended up replacing our CEO, a very popular, charismatic, easy to love founder. David Nealman, the person holding the sign in this picture, was replaced by that good looking gentleman on the left who happens to be my brother. We were both on the startup team together. But even though both of these folks were awesome, like Steve Jobs and Tim Cook, the leadership change was traumatic for employees and investors, and it took some time to navigate. While we were going through the cash shortage that was a result of the fuel crisis, we were approached multiple times by leaders at Delta and Southwest telling us that they were probably going to buy us in the next week or two. So we had to deal with that. This is the security environment that we have to deal with at airports. You all know this. You've flown, you go to airports. It's a terrible environment there now, and we, the airlines, just have to navigate this new environment. The airlines are fairly well known for labor issues, and we had our share of, union campaigns. We had to deal with that. And then all of JetBlue's equipment came from other parts of the world. We flew Airbuses from the European Union, and we flew Embraers from Brazil. So any issues that had to do with international politics, policy, COVID quarantines, all are the kinds of things that impacted JetBlue's ability to operate. And then coming back to this coronavirus problem, sometimes your crises don't come from within your own company. They come from someplace else. All things that we have to navigate. And as I wrap up here and turn it over for some Q&A, I would leave you with this advice about crisis leadership. First, I'm going to borrow here from my military colleagues from the U.S. Army. They have a framework they like to use called Be, Know, Do. And here's how I think about crisis leadership in that Be, Know, Do framework. First of all, what do you need to be as a crisis leader? Well, and think about this through the lens of those leading maybe the university or the Ross School of Business through this crisis. They need to be visible. Okay? You need to see them. You need to know that someone has this thing or is working this issue. They need to be caring. They need to care about their stakeholders. They need to be empathetic. It's not just they need to care about them, but they need to be hearing from them so they know, what they're going through so they can deal more effectively. They need to be calm. You don't want to see your leaders panicking. You want to see that they're actually under control and can logically think through this situation. And you want them to be assertive. You don't just want to be visible. You want to see them doing things so that we're making it feels like they're engaged in helping us progress through this thing. That's the B area. Knowing. As a crisis leader, you want to know kind of the vision of the organization. Where is it that we're trying to go? How does this thing get in the way of allowing us to get there so that we can create a response that's consistent with our vision? We also need to know our values. JetBlue as a company was very well known, and there's been a lot of research done on how effectively JetBlue has employed its value system: safety, caring, integrity, fun, passion. We created those 20 years ago. I haven't been at the company for 9 years now. I'll remember those for the next 40 years if I'm alive that long. It was that deeply ingrained with not only what we did, but how we made decisions at the company. Very important, what the value system is at your organization and align your crisis management efforts with those. And you need to have some guiding principles to help you make decisions. You may be interested to know that Dean DeRue and leaders at the Ross School had a set of guiding principles that we used still today on a daily basis to make the decisions that we're making about helping us navigate through this coronavirus problem. And then from a do perspective, we need to communicate. And the asterisk here is supposed to represent the reality that all of you put yourself in, think about from your own perspective now on COVID-19. What are you hoping to see from leadership on a really frequent basis in terms of communication? Anything. Tell us what's going on. It's fascinating how sometimes when we're not in a crisis, we're spending our time thinking about not clogging your email boxes because you get so many emails from us. Here we are in the midst of a crisis, and what do you all want from us as leaders? You want us to tell you what's going on. And so this little asterisk was supposed to remind me to say, a good principle for leadership communication is, because people are anxious when a crisis is ongoing, no news is actually news. If nothing is changing, then let people know that nothing is changing. You have nothing new to add. Okay? People are looking for that. We need to be able to make decisions with limited information. We need to take responsibility, and we need to engage our stakeholders, as should be obvious now with all of the energy that I put into this conversation today around the importance and the unique perspectives of different stakeholders. Being a high stakes leader will require you to face really harsh realities, to embrace vulnerability, having to make decisions with limited information, and to lead without a playbook. And if you're looking for some great examples, as I get ready to turn it back to you here, Lindy, for our last few minutes, if you're looking for great examples of organizations or people that have demonstrated these be no do principles, Stan McChrystal, General Stan McChrystal, who was a board member at JetBlue, someone I got to know pretty well in my time at JetBlue, just published this article a couple of days ago in the New York Times. And in it, he talks about how leaders should be thinking about navigating a crisis situation. Go find this article. It's a great read. Okay? The CEO and president of JetBlue, also pretty good friends of mine, put this note out to their crew members, what they call employees, a couple of days ago, that demonstrated this be no do framework. Here's where we are. Here's what we're grappling with as a company and as an industry. Here's what we need from you, and here's how we're going to survive this because of our principles, our values, our vision, and how we're going to do it together. And even Jeff Bezos has now, published or sent out a note to Amazonians across his system, letting them know how he's thinking about this crisis, how he's thinking about them, how he wants them to be safe, and how the organization is going to navigate this crisis. So all great examples here of leaders who have embraced the items that I mentioned in this be no do framework. And finally, business will be incredibly unpredictable. You can't be over prepared for a crisis. People are going to look for leaders who are demonstrating tangible evidence of leadership. They want and need leaders to believe in. Your best chance to rally your stakeholders around your leadership situation, around kind of the direction forward, is to really understand and appreciate what their value proposition is, what their perspective is. Great crisis leaders really know how to address the unique needs of all of their stakeholders, and crisis leadership requires leaders that are willing and able to step up, deal with these things when leadership is needed most, and particularly be able to navigate when there isn't a playbook. So, Lindy, I've been a little bit wordy today, but hopefully this was useful for the folks that joined us.
That was wonderful, Mike. That was inspiring and clear and great stories to help make it really real about how you lead in these situations. We've had a couple of questions come in, as well as a lot of compliments in the talk. A couple of the questions were about managing stakeholders specifically, and how do you prioritize stakeholders? So someone asked the question, shouldn't customers be the first or highest priority stakeholder in a crisis?
Yeah, so a couple of things I would say about understanding stakeholders. So first of all, knowing your stakeholders is not just a matter of preparing for a crisis. Knowing your stakeholders is what business is all about, right? So you will know the value propositions of all your stakeholders. Part of the reason that I did the little exercise with United Airlines and Samsung and Starbucks is that in each of those scenarios, even though the first two scenarios were very much customer focused, the rest of those scenarios weren't so much customer focused. So the type of crisis that you are dealing with is actually going to inform how you prioritize your stakeholders. The reality of a crisis is you won't have time to immediately engage all of your stakeholders, and you'll have to engage all of them eventually. But in the immediate term, while you're grappling with a crisis, the crisis itself, by its type and nature, will tell you these are the 2 or 3 stakeholder groups that I need to reach out to right now. I think you'll find when you give this some thought that it'll become pretty obvious how to prioritize those.
A quick follow-up question on that one then is, how do you manage stakeholders that you don't get to first? Do you need to give some communication to manage that, or you just go on your order?
Yeah, so the best practices in those areas are companies that are really prepared for dealing with crisis tend to have a playbook. So I've mentioned a couple of times you're dealing with no playbook. Companies actually do have a general kind of generic playbook, and they typically include in those playbooks some kind of generic starters for messages that they can send out to the broader stakeholder community. So, you know, step one should be, we need to get a kind of a high level message out to everybody so that everybody knows we're aware that there's a problem going on. And then from there, you now start to send out very targeted messages to different priority stakeholder groups. But yes, there needs to be a kind of a stream of really high level generic messages that go out to all of your stakeholders.
Super helpful, thank you. Final broad level question I thought that was very interesting that came in. As with response to the current pandemic, we're seeing many CEOs responding and truly leading the nation in preventative actions. What implications does this have for executive leaders in the future and the impact of their business decisions and crises like?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, Professor Greer and I are academics, we're teachers, we're folks that are really committed to helping other people develop. And so through that lens, we see this as one of the greatest opportunities ever for leaders to develop their skills in grappling with these, you know, very VUCA-like scenarios like the coronavirus. So I think what you're seeing is different levels of effectiveness as leaders do step out in front of these things. I think we're seeing some leaders that are doing just an exceptional job of taking this responsibility. And then I think we're seeing examples sometimes on TV fairly regularly, leaders that are not really leading in a way that is inspiring confidence and trust and in line with the things that I talked about today. So I think the implications of this long term, more than anything, are that leaders at any level in pretty much any organization are now going to acknowledge that a crisis situation can develop that we never thought of before, that we could have never done anything about. It was going to come at us, and that we should really spend more time preparing, even if we don't have the kind of the textbook 100% solution, but at least we've thought our way through. So what happens if we do have a product failure? What happens if we do have an energy crisis, or there's a major economic downturn, or now I think the reality is companies are going to have and what happens if there's some broad, you know, healthcare issue that limits our ability to operate, to reach customers? I think that every company now is going to have some sort of playbook on how do we deal with something like this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're at time here. We did record this and we'll release it afterwards for people that are interested or have friends that should see this too. Thank you, Mike, for offering this session for us. It was so incredibly helpful. And to everybody out there that's watching, stay well, and hopefully you can exhibit good leadership from this. Thank you.
Okay. Be safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Mike, I did get questions of where you teach at Ross. And so for people that are still listening, we have some questions of, do you teach any executive MBA courses specifically on this?
This is an MBA course. So
okay.
Teach it every quarter. So it's pretty super popular.
This is in the full-time MBA program?
I'm sorry? Yeah, full-time MBA.
And do you do online MBA or executive MBA for the course or not?
I do. There's actually a MO 711 now is a new online version of this course. And so we are trying to figure out ways to make it available to audiences beyond the MBA group.
Awesome. I got some questions about it, people who wanted to take a full course.
Yeah.
So
Excellent.
Okay, if there's any other questions, I just see a lot of thank yous and compliments come in and off the chat, Mike. So thank you again.
Super.
Okay.
Any other themes in the questions as we're winding down here?
No, the two main themes were stakeholder management and sort of the
Yeah.
prioritization and like the different, how you weight the different stakeholders when, which I thought you gave a great answer to. And the other one was a little bit more going into the implications for business leadership now, and also the fact now that business leaders are being more implicated in societal crises and
Yeah.
having a say on societal crises. And what does that mean for leadership in the future? Will business leaders be more expected to weigh in on these issues than they historically have?
Yeah. Well, I certainly think that just the way, the traditional media and social media play is, I don't think you have a choice. You got to get out in front of it. And I think the hardest thing for leaders through a kind of a traditional leadership lens is that, there's this I guess false belief that leaders are supposed to know everything. They're just omniscient and they have all the answers, and they'll stand up in front of people and say, here is exactly what's going on. And crisis environments, as we're all learning now, right, there's only so much you can know.
Well, your answers keep getting more interest. So we also have a question now. Is MO711 going to be offered for the weekend MBA too?
We are working toward making it available to as many different groups as we can. So if you're still on their weekend MBA, we're trying to make that happen.
Great. If you want to have one more question, I was interested for this too. Of specific leaders you think have done a good job in the current pandemic?
I'm sorry, the first part of that was, have they?
Do you have any examples? Like, I don't know if you saw the speech of the Marriott CEO, but are there any specific leaders right now you feel have done a really good job during the pandemic, either business leaders or corporate or government leaders?
Well, I think that Governor Cuomo is actually doing a pretty good job in New York. It's obviously it's a big state and lots of media attention. So part of the trick here is you get camera time, you can lead. I think he's doing a really super job. I think that that the job, all three of the examples I gave at the end, I think were pretty good examples of leaders trying to get out in front of this. I have some really good examples of not good job, but I'll try to move. I will not go there today.
Fair.
Awesome. And if we keep talking, people aren't going to sign off, so we should probably go ahead and close up.
I'm getting the final thank you. So thank you again, Mike. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Take care.